Let's discuss a broad range of issues with Republican Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar of South Florida. She's a member of the DOGE caucus and serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Congresswoman, great to see you. Thanks so much for being with us. I want to talk to you about DOGE and the cabinet meeting.
Thanks for having us.
Of course, but we just heard from Nick Payton-Walsh there live in Kyiv. I want to get your reaction to critics of this rare earth minerals deal who are describing it as extortion of a victim. What would you say in response?
Oh, no, I don't think that at all. And I think Zelensky he agreed that if he wants to make a deal with the United States, he can contribute something that we need. There's nothing wrong in give and take. And I love the fact that Zelensky is on the radar, that we are going to be helping Ukraine, continue helping Ukraine. And if they have to give something back or repay the debt, I'm sure they don't have any problems. What they need is the support of the United States military and Europe, not only Ukraine. They need to have that reassurance too. So it's a fair game, give and take, and we're both winning, the United States and Ukraine.
Moving on to DOGE, we've heard from several of your Republican colleagues and some cabinet officials who were in that meeting today as well that have expressed confusion and concern about the way that DOGE has gone about some of these firings and rehirings. You've heard some of these reports about officials who oversee the nuclear arsenal, for example, who've responded to bird flu, to Ebola as well. Do you believe that DOGE has authority over cabinet officials in determining who should be cut?
Look, I think that we have to put this into perspective and into context. What Elon Musk is doing is what Congress should have done 50 years ago. Go in, see where we are spending our money, or the taxpayers' money, and clean the abuse, the waste, and the fraud. That hasn't been done. And sometimes maybe the righteous are going to pay for the sinners. But he is doing a good job, and he's doing exactly what we are supposed to be doing. The federal government is responsible for the taxpayers' money, and we need to make sure that those monies go to where they need to go. It's impossible for USAID to be, I don't have to repeat it, you've heard it. $12 million for Guatemala. The Guatemalans do not want the money. $55 billion that they have discovered that has been wasted or fraud. That can't be happening. That can't be happening. And for that reason, Trump won on the message that we're going to clean up and we're going to reduce the debt that we have, which is $2 trillion a year. We have a deficit. We have a debt of $33 trillion. So when the average American viewer or voter hears what's happening, they go, yeah, welcome Musk or anybody that is going to do the cleanup. That's what he's doing. Maybe he's not perfect and impeccable, but he is cleaning up house. And that's what we need. The good programs, keep the good programs and make them better.
Sure. There have been calls from some of your Republican colleagues for more congressional involvement into that work of determining what should stay and what should go. There are also questions about transparency and exactly how Musk's personal, professional, business interests might conflict with some of the work that he's doing with DOGE. I wonder what kind of oversight you have on the DOGE caucus over Musk and his associates, and whether you can tell us, for example, what they're doing with this sensitive financial information of millions of Americans at these systems at Treasury and at the Social Security Administration.
Listen, Boris, I think that Congress, I'm sure that Musk will welcome and appreciate the fact if we can help him from the legislative point of view. I think that his intentions are the best. He doesn't think about it. He doesn't have to be doing this. He's the richest guy in the world. He could be on a rocket somewhere. Where is he? He's helping us. He's helping our government get better and get leaner. So we do have to appreciate that. He is bringing dozens of his best minds to find all this out, to help with the algorithms, to understand where the waste, the fraud, and the abuse is at in all these different federal programs. So we appreciate what he's doing. I don't think that he's going to profit. He has contracts with a DOJ or DOD. He has government contracts. He doesn't need to be doing what he's doing in order to make more money that he doesn't need. So I think it's the other way around. We got to be very grateful that he's wanting to do this and investing his time, energy, and money into it.
I do want to get your thoughts on a number of other things, Congresswoman, and I want to make sure we're as efficient as possible with getting answers. I want to ask you about the budget blueprint that House Republicans passed yesterday. They're calling on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which oversees Medicaid, to cut some $880 billion in spending. Would you support some of those cuts coming from Medicaid?
I support to clean up the system, which is what Musk is doing. I know what you're telling me is $880 billion that Energy and Commerce, but I am sure that for what I have learned and in all the meetings that I have been to, that the benefits are not going to be cut. What's going to be cut are the waste and the fraud, and that we are not going to have to touch those who need Medicaid. We understand. I mean, Florida has a great need for Medicaid recipients, so I am confident, because it's not only for the Floridians, for the New Yorkers. Everyone agrees that you cannot touch those who deserve the benefits.
Understood. One more issue that was brought up in the cabinet meeting that would affect your constituents. As you know, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans and Cubans in your district who came into the country the right way. As President Trump said during the cabinet meeting, he wants immigrants to come to the United States the right way. They're now potentially at risk of deportation because of some new immigration policies. What is your message to them and to the White House?
My message to the White House has been very clear. We have to make a differentiation between the Tren de Aragua and those Venezuelans who came in through the TPS. I am sure that we're going to come to an understanding. We're talking about 600,000 Venezuelans that are group expires in April, another group expires in September, and I'm sure that the Trump administration understands that these people who are here fleeing communism, and that we need to keep them under that TPS protection. These are not illegals. This is not Tren de Aragua or MS-13. These are good people who came, and we welcome them, and I'm sure they're going to be able to stay.
On the subject of Venezuela, before we go, Congresswoman, just moments ago, Trump announced that he would reverse a concession given to Venezuela as part of an oil deal made by President Biden. Chevron, a U.S. Producer of oil, has had this exception in Venezuela through the Biden administration into the Trump administration. Trump administration officials have not said whether they want regime change. In fact, I believe Rick Grinnell, who went down there to negotiate the release of some Americans in Caracas, said that Trump does not want regime change. That's a marked shift from his first term. Do you agree with that stance that Nicolás Maduro should remain in power?
And I don't agree that President Trump believes what Mr. Grinnell is saying. Maybe he got that idea somewhere else. We do, but we all agree, Grinnell, the president, and ourselves, and the South Florida delegation, we all agree that what the president did is outstanding, and that we are very grateful for what he's done. And you know why? Because Chevron was producing $500 million a month to Maduro and his regime. He's using that money for the repressive apparatus. Enough. An American company cannot give a regime, a communist regime, any weapons or any money in order for them to suppress their people, who, by the way, Maduro had an election last year, and he signed an agreement called the Barbados Agreement, where he committed to leave if he lost the presidential elections. Well, he did, 70-30. What is he doing still in power? Nothing. It's in the benefit of the United States to do away with Maduro, because then those oil rigs will definitely be, the American companies will be welcomed to partnership with the oil industry in Venezuela, and we're going to be able to have a win-win situation, just like we're having with Ukraine and the United States.
Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar, we have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much for sharing your point of view.
Thank you. To you, Boris.